Imagine being sealed inside a chamber. The air is cold, metallic. There's a faint chemical smell you can't quite identify. Something sterile, something wrong. But it's subtle enough that you tell yourself it's nothing. Just the room. Just the concrete and the steel and the recycled air pushing through the vents above your head. You don't feel tired, not at first. Actually, you feel fine. Better than fine. Sharp, alert, aware of everything. The hum of the ventilation system, the faint scratching of someone's pen on paper, the way the fluorescent light above you flickers every 40 seconds like it's breathing. But by day 3, you stop sleeping entirely. Not because you're trying to stay awake, not because you're fighting it, because the urge is simply gone. And by day 5, something else is gone too. Something harder to name, something that lived behind your eyes and made you you. By day 9, you are pacing the chamber walls, and the researchers watching through the small reinforced viewport in the door have gone very, very quiet. And by day 15, the scientists who sealed you inside that room are terrified to open the door. Welcome back. If you are new here, and given what you're about to hear, I almost want to warn you to leave. This channel is dedicated to the stories that history tried to swallow whole. The accounts that were filed away in sealed archives, stamped with classifications that were never lifted, passed down in whispers between the people who were there and the people who couldn't stop thinking about what those people told them. Some of the stories on this channel are confirmed history. Some exist in the gray territory between documented fact and something more elusive. And some sit in a category that is harder to define. Stories that cannot be entirely proven, but cannot, if you look closely enough at the world they emerged from, be entirely dismissed. Tonight's story lives in that third category, the Russian sleep experiment. You may have heard the name. You may have stumbled across pieces of it in the darker corners of the internet, in forum threads that got too long and too serious, in comment sections where people who claimed to have read the original documents spoke in careful, measured language that didn't match the platform they were writing on. You may have been told it's fiction. And I am going to tell you something that the people who say that tend to leave out. The world this story emerged from, the laboratories, the ethics, the ideology, the documented hunger for human experimentation that defined Soviet-era science in the mid-20th century, that world was real. Every piece of the infrastructure that would have made this experiment possible existed, was funded, was operational. What happened inside one particular sealed chamber in the late 1940s may or may not be what this story claims. But the fact that it could have happened, that is what keeps people awake at night. Segment 1. The world it came from. To understand why the Russian sleep experiment cuts so deep, you first need to understand the environment that produced it. The late 1940s. The Soviet Union in the immediate aftermath of World War II. A nation that had lost somewhere between 27 and 40 million people, estimates still vary, and emerged from that catastrophic bloodletting with something to prove. Something burning and cold at the same time, the way only ideological conviction can burn. Science was a weapon, not metaphorically, literally. The Soviet state poured resources into scientific programs that the rest of the world would not learn about for decades, some of which the rest of the world still has not fully learned about. Programs designed to push the human body and mind past the limits that nature had assigned them. Programs built on the foundational belief that those limits were not natural law. They were simply problems waiting to be engineered away. Sleep was one of those problems. Think about what sleep deprivation means in a military context. Every army in the world is constrained by the biological need for rest. Soldiers need to sleep. Remove that need, chemically, surgically, by whatever means necessary, and you have fundamentally altered the calculus of warfare. You have soldiers who never stop, never slow down, never lose their edge to exhaustion at the critical moment. The Soviets were not the only ones thinking about this. American military research in the same period explored stimulants and performance enhancement with an ambition that history has been slow to fully reckon with. But the Soviet program operated under a different set of constraints. specifically the absence of any meaningful ethical oversight whatsoever. Human subjects were not a problem to be navigated. They were a resource to be allocated. The gulags held millions, political prisoners, people who had said the wrong thing, known the wrong person, been born into the wrong family during the wrong political moment. People who had, in the language of the state, forfeited their claim to normal consideration, and for certain researchers in certain facilities, those people were available. This is the world in which the Russian sleep experiment allegedly took place. Not a world of cartoon villainy, not a world that was obviously visibly monstrous from the inside. A world of clipboards and fluorescent lights, and researchers in white coats who filed reports and attended committee meetings and went home to their families and believed, at least some of them, that what they were doing was necessary. That is the most disturbing part of the infrastructure, not the cruelty, the normalcy surrounding the cruelty. Segment 2, the setup. 5 subjects were selected. Political prisoners. Men who were told, in the language of bureaucratic transaction that the Soviet state had perfected, that participation in this study would be considered positively when their cases were reviewed. That cooperation was in their best interest. They were not told what the study involved. They were told it was a sleep study, that they would be monitored, that they needed to remain awake for 30 days. 30 days. The researchers likely knew that 30 days was not a realistic target. The purpose of framing it that way may have been to set a number large enough that the subjects would not begin counting down too early, would not spend the first week doing arithmetic. 30 days feels like a sentence. It feels like something to endure rather than something to survive. The 5 men were placed inside a sealed, airtight chamber. The chamber was large enough to move around in, designed to feel livable, not immediately oppressive. There were cots along the walls, there were books, there was a toilet. There was enough space to pace, which all 5 men would eventually do, for very different reasons, as the days went on. The walls were concrete, the floor was concrete. The single door was heavy steel with a small reinforced glass viewport and a speaker system for communication. Microphones lined the ceiling, picking up everything. Every conversation, every sound, every shift in the acoustic texture of the room that might indicate a change in the subject's condition. Through the ventilation system, the researchers introduced the gas. It was a stimulant compound, experimental, undocumented in any published literature, developed specifically for this program. The subjects knew there was something in the air. They had been told it was an oxygen-enriching supplement, something to help them stay alert. Whether any of the 5 men believed that explanation is something the record does not address. What the record describes in the early days is this: 5 men behaving like 5 men who had been locked in a room together under unusual circumstances. They were cautious with each other, polite in the slightly formal way that people are polite when they are being watched and know it. They talked, they read, they slept on the first night without incident, the gas apparently not yet at sufficient concentration to override the body's demand. By the second night, sleep was shorter, more interrupted. The men woke frequently and stayed awake for longer stretches before returning to their cots. By the third night, no one slept at all. The researchers noted this without alarm. This was, after all, the intended effect. The gas was working. The subjects were awake and, by all observable measures, functional, alert. They had begun to talk more, animated conversations that the microphones picked up clearly, discussions about their cases, about their families, about the world outside, about things that seemed to the researchers listening like the entirely normal speech of men who were bored and confined and making the best of it. Everything was going according to the parameters of the study, for exactly 4 more days. Segment 3, the unraveling, day 7. The conversations changed. It happened gradually enough that the researchers almost missed it. Looking back at the transcripts that allegedly survived, that allegedly passed through enough hands over enough decades to reach the person whose account forms the basis of this story. Looking back at them, the shift is visible around day 5, day 6. Subtle. The way the men's sentences began to lose their logical threading. the way responses stopped quite matching what had been said to prompt them. By day 7, it was unmistakable. The men were no longer having conversations with each other. They were having conversations at each other, parallel monologues that occasionally intersected but never truly connected, paranoid in their texture, not accusatory yet, but watchful, guarded, each man speaking as though the others were potential threats whose reactions needed to be managed. One subject, designated Subject 3 in the account, stopped contributing to the group conversations entirely on day 7. He moved his cot to the far corner of the chamber, the corner furthest from the viewport, and he sat on it with his back against the wall and his face toward the center of the room. He did not read, he did not pace. He simply sat and watched the other 4 men with an expression that the researchers peering through the viewport described as evaluative, as though he was running calculations, as though he was solving a problem, and the other 4 men were variables in that problem. Day 8. Subject 2 stopped sleeping, stopped attempting to sleep, and began pacing. A specific route, the same route every time, a rectangle that took him from the door to the back wall and back again. The microphones picked up the sound of his footsteps as a constant backdrop to everything else that happened from this point onward. Back and forth, back and forth. 12 steps in each direction, the researchers counted. Never 11, never 13, always 12. He paced like this for 18 hours before he stopped. When he stopped, he stood in the center of the room and spoke, not to any of the other subjects, but directly at one of the ceiling microphones. His voice, according to the account, was completely calm, conversational. He said that he knew they were listening. He said that he wanted them to understand that he was fine. He said it in the careful, deliberate way that people speak when they are trying to convince someone of something they themselves are not sure of. He said, "Whatever is in the air, it's not hurting us. We're better. We're thinking more clearly. I need you to understand that." Then he returned to pacing. Day 9. The first scream. It came from Subject 4, the youngest of the 5 according to the account, and it erupted without warning in the middle of a period of complete silence. Not a scream of pain, not a scream of fear, exactly. Something more primitive than either of those things. A sound that the researchers described in language that kept appearing in different forms across the account as wrong. Fundamentally, structurally wrong in the way that sounds in the wrong context are wrong. The way a voice is wrong when the face making it is showing the wrong expression. It lasted for 11 seconds and then it stopped. Subject 4 sat down on his cot. He folded his hands in his lap. He stared at the floor. He did not scream again for 2 days. Day 10. Subject 1 began tearing apart the books. Not in a rage. That is what the researchers noted and kept noting. The absence of rage. He sat cross-legged on the floor, and he systematically removed pages from each book and arranged them on the concrete around him in a pattern that no one watching through the viewport could decode. Hours of this. Patient and precise, his face showing nothing that any of the researchers could interpret as an emotion they recognized. When he had processed all the books, he sat in the center of his paper arrangement, and he looked up at the viewport. He looked at it for a very long time, and then he smiled. Segment 4. What the microphones recorded. On day 11, the chamber went silent, not gradually, not in the way that noise tapers off when people grow tired or run out of things to say. All at once, between one recorded moment and the next on the monitoring logs, the sound of the chamber dropped to nothing. No footsteps, no pacing, no voices, no screaming. The researchers checked the microphones. The equipment was functioning perfectly. The silence was not a technical failure. The 5 subjects had simply stopped producing sound. For the next 4 days, the chamber was silent. The researchers watched through the viewport as much as their shifts allowed. The 5 men were awake, visibly, clearly, disturbingly awake, their eyes open and their bodies in motion, slow and purposeful. But they were producing no sound that the microphones could detect. Whatever they were communicating, if they were communicating, was happening below the threshold of the equipment, or it was happening without sound at all. On day 13, one of the younger researchers, who had been spending increasing amounts of time at the viewport during his shifts, increasingly unable to look away, reported something in his notes that was initially dismissed by his colleagues as fatigue-induced error. He wrote, "Subject 3 turned and looked directly at the viewport at 0314. He could not have seen me. The glass is one way. He looked at the exact position of my eyes for approximately 4 minutes. He did not look at the viewport. He looked at me." On day 14, 2 other researchers reported identical experiences. Subject 3, at different times, in different lighting conditions, with different people at the glass, always turned and looked at the exact position of the observer's eyes. The researchers had not told each other about their individual experiences until they compared notes on the morning of day 15. The comparison of those notes is what prompted the decision to open the chamber, not concern for the subjects, fear of them. Segment 5, opening the door. The protocol called for the gas to be cut and fresh air pumped in for 1 hour before the chamber was opened. This was done. The subjects were informed over the intercom that the study was concluding and that they should move to the center of the room and remain calm. There was no response. The subjects did not move to the center of the room. They moved, all 5 of them, to the walls, each to a separate wall. They pressed their backs against the concrete and they faced the door, and they waited. The researchers, watching through the viewport, delayed the opening. It took a direct order from the supervising official, a man whose name does not appear clearly in any version of the account, who is referred to only by a title and a description, before the locks were disengaged. The sound of the locks was loud in the silence of the corridor, each one deliberate. Each one final sounding in a way that mechanisms designed purely for function should not sound. The door opened. The smell that came out of the chamber was, and this detail appears in the account with a specificity that is hard to read as embellishment, not what anyone expected. It was not the smell of 5 men in an enclosed space for 15 days, though that was present underneath. It was something else, something chemical and organic at the same time, something that the researchers who were present would later describe in separate conversations, using variations of the same phrase. A smell like the inside of something that should be closed. What they saw inside the chamber cannot be fully described in a video intended for a general audience. What can be said is this: the subjects were alive, all 5 of them. Awake, conscious, and functional in some definition of that word that would need to be significantly revised to apply to what they had become. Their physical condition represented deterioration that, by any medical framework available at the time, should have taken years, not 15 days. The researchers' first assumption, seeing them, was that the timeline was wrong, that something had gone wrong with the clocks, that far more time had passed inside the chamber than outside it. The timeline had not been wrong. The subjects did not want to leave. When the soldiers who had been stationed in the corridor entered to extract them, all 5 men fought. With a ferocity and a pain tolerance, a complete apparent absence of pain response, that the soldiers had not been briefed to expect and were not prepared for. It took significant force, and the force that was required was applied. And the sounds that were made during that process were heard clearly in the corridor outside, through the open door, by the researchers who were standing there. None of those researchers, by any account, looked through the door while it was happening. When it was over and the subjects had been sedated and removed on stretchers, one of the researchers walked to the door of the empty chamber and looked inside. He stood there for a moment. He turned to the nearest colleague and said something. The exact words vary across versions of the account, but the core of what he said is consistent. They weren't trying to escape, they were trying to stay. Whatever was in there with them, they didn't want to leave it. Segment 6, the question that remains. Here is where the honest version of this story has to pause. The Russian sleep experiment, as a document, as a text, was published anonymously online in 2010. It was written brilliantly, precisely, with an attention to psychological and atmospheric detail that is unusual in the genre, as a piece of horror fiction. The author has never been definitively identified. The story spread faster and further than almost any piece of horror writing in the early internet era because it did something rare. It felt, in its texture, in its clinical language, and its cold procedural tone, like something that had been declassified rather than invented. That is the honest answer to is it real? But here is the question that the honest answer does not close. The Soviet Union's experimental programs in human subjects during this period were not fiction. They are documented. The willingness to use prisoners as experimental subjects, to operate entirely outside any ethical constraint, to pursue military and ideological advantage through human cost that was simply not counted. All of that is historical record. Sleep deprivation research was conducted. Stimulant compounds were developed and tested. The specific mechanisms that the story describes, the gas, the sealed chamber, the monitoring infrastructure, all of it maps onto programs and facilities that we know existed in some form. What we know about sleep deprivation, confirmed by research that was conducted ethically and documented publicly, is already disturbing enough. 72 hours without sleep produces hallucinations in most subjects. The hallucinations are vivid, multisensory, and often indistinguishable from reality. The subject cannot always identify that they are hallucinating. They are experiencing something completely real from the inside that has no external correlate. 5 days without sleep begins to produce psychotic episodes in some subjects. Loss of identity cohesion, the dissolution of the boundary between self and environment. Paranoia so complete, it becomes the operating system rather than a symptom. 10 days represents the outer limit of documented human endurance in controlled studies. What happens past that point, chemically prevented, neurologically forced, with no possibility of the brain defaulting to the unconsciousness it is designed to require, is not documented, not publicly, not in any source that can be freely cited. We stopped the studies before we reached that point, or we stopped the documented studies. What the Russian sleep experiment asks, in its fictional form, in its horror story architecture, is a question that sits underneath all of that established science, like a deep water current beneath a surface that looks still. What is on the other side of the sleep barrier? Not the other side of exhaustion, not the hallucinations and the psychosis, which are, in their terrible way, still recognizably human experiences. The other side of the physiological limit itself. The place a human mind goes when the door that closes every night, the door that the mind requires, that evolution built in over millions of years for reasons we still don't fully understand, when that door is chemically welded shut. Is there something waiting there? And if there is, if whatever the 5 subjects encountered in 15 days of forced wakefulness was real in the way that the story presents it as real, was it always there? Is it there right now? On the other side of the sleep you will fall into tonight, patient and present, and watching through a door that has always been thinner than you knew. I want to leave you with one final detail. In every version of this account, the original text, the retellings, the analyses, the debunkings, and the discussions that have persisted for 15 years across platforms and languages and communities that have nothing else in common. There is one consistent element that appears in a place where invented horror stories don't usually bother with consistency. The subjects, when asked, when they were coherent enough to respond to questions before the sedatives took hold, did not describe what had happened to them as suffering. They did not want to leave the chamber. They fought to stay. And the one subject who spoke most clearly, most coherently, in the moments before sedation, who looked at the lead researcher with eyes that were fully open and fully awake, and something else besides, said something that was recorded and that appears, with slight variations in phrasing but identical in meaning, across every version of this account. You should not have opened the door. We had almost remembered everything. Sleep well tonight. And if you wake up in the dark, suddenly, completely, the way you sometimes do, with no dream to explain it and no sound to account for it, and the room feels different than it did when you closed your eyes, don't think about what might be on the other side of the door that just closed. If this story reached something in you, if it found the part of you that knows, somehow, that some questions are dangerous not because the answers are terrible, but because the asking opens something, then you already know where you belong. Subscribe, the bell icon, turn on every notification, because the next story is already waiting, and it does not get better than this one. It gets worse.